So my name is Luca Gattobigio. You can see my name at this slide. Working for LSEC. I already presented myself to the group here, but I'm repeating shortly for the people online. I'm working for LSEC on this project, OpenCloudification, and my background is a bit on the clouds. I was already contributing in other open clouds.
Luca, can you speak a little louder?
Yes, of course. And thank you. I was working in other projects about open cloud already, so that's more or less my background. And today I'm gonna talk a bit about some open source technologies at the state of the art. But as Frederick said at the beginning, this is the first event of this project. So the idea is give some inspiration, like telling some stories that happened in other companies and give you an idea, mostly to think about it. Quickly on the OpenCloudification project, two sides, theory and practice. We're going to go for the state-of-the-art research about cloud and edge computing, all the tools and applications that are already available. We're going to analyze them, write white papers about it, to provide guidelines, best practices, and so on, working on seminars, events like this one. And on the practical side, help the companies move towards the cloud, making tutorials, workshops, and provide sandboxes and toolings that can help for that. We're trying to cover all the possible levels of knowledge about the cloud, starting from a basic level up to an advanced one. So either you know nothing about what a cloud is, up to you're already adopting the cloud, like fully adopting it, but you're still looking for state-of-the-art, then we can help you. And in that sense, we're gonna divide our topics in basic concept, advanced concepts, and we believe there's a need of a more detailed explanation on cloud and edge interaction. So there will be a big focus on that as well. And each concept then it will be made for all the different levels. So no matter if you are already an advanced user of the cloud, we will still. It's also a good refresher, to follow basic concepts and see what are the updates in that sense. Talking about open source and cloud, there are, of course, a lot of good reasons to use open source. Louder. Okay. Okay, I'll try. Sorry. There are a lot of good reasons to use open source on the cloud. We already started discussing about it. Main reasons, I'm displaying them. Cost efficiency, because in the end, you don't have to pay any license for that. They're high flexible and customizable, because in the end, having access to the source code means that you can do your own modifications and adapt them to your needs and requirements. If the open source tools are quite famous, then they have a large base and an active communities that can help you. And that also leads to collaboration and innovation, because you actually can implement anything that you would like to have in the open source tools. This also helps with interoperability, for example, but those are like just some examples. The list is way longer than this. Of course, there are cons as well. Few examples. Sometimes the documentation about open source tools are not necessarily well described, or the level of support is not what you will look like if compared to a paid solution. Sometimes it's written by technical people or developers that know what they're doing, but they might be not as user-friendly as a paid alternative. And the third point here says security, which is actually both sides, because on one hand, yeah, you're exposing your source code, meaning that attackers can find vulnerabilities. But on the other side, someone might spot it and help you fixing that. So I consider security, yeah, it's a not, but also a problem. This is the image that I was saying is going to be shown multiple times today, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Each square represents an open source tool with the intent of being useful for the cloud. There are so many different open source tools that it's impossible to know all of them or which one to use, because most of them are developed for the same reason, but with the same scope, maybe just slightly different. So which one to pick, for example, that's complicated. I'm not going to go into details because also I know that we will have future presentations today about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Just to give an idea on how it works, there are different levels: sandbox, incubating, and graduated. They're the three main levels based on the level of maturity that a specific tool already reached. Here I'm picking just a few examples. I mean, Kubernetes is probably the most famous graduated open source tool that they have in their roster. And if you consider just only the graduated projects, there are about 20 different projects that they have available. And I'm pretty sure that no one knows all of them. So the goal today of this presentation is just to give you some insight of some of this, because otherwise it will take way longer to explain all of them. And I'm going to skip Kubernetes because Kubernetes probably is well known by everyone. Prometheus. This is a monitoring and alerting system. I think Chris then is going to talk about it a bit more because of your spin-off. It's dedicated to monitoring. Collect, store, query data, metrics, generate alerts. It's a quite famous open source tool. And it's famous also because it's easy to integrate with other tools and services, either open source or not. It's quite famous for being used with Kubernetes within clusters, but it works with any cloud native application. One use case that I liked that I wanted to represent here comes from Cloudflare. They wrote in one of their blog posts how they need to improve a few years ago the monitoring capabilities of their company using their own Cloudflare analytic dashboard. And then they started the process and adopted Prometheus together with other open source tools. And from that, then get a lot of benefits just adopting an open source component. They improved the monitoring capabilities. So it was easier to have an overview of their system and a better understanding of that, which is something quite useful because any problem that you might have, it's hard to spot if you don't have a way to look at it. They managed to combine it with other data coming from other sources in a way that they could get more useful alerts. And that also improved their day-to operations, because at that point, debugging incidents or analyze the system usage and so on was easier for the engineers because they have a better way of see their own system. So this is one example of applying Prometheus and integrate it in your environment. Another graduated project is Helm. It's a package manager, again, for Kubernetes. The idea there is that you use packaged format that are called charts, in which you define and then it makes you easier to install, upgrade, or manage your application within Kubernetes. And the use case that I'm showing, in this case, it comes from Ticketmaster. They have a nice presentation that they made for one of the CNCF events a few years ago. In that case, they needed to manage 15 different Kubernetes clusters which were deployed in multiple regions and environments. So they started using Helm charts, and then they realized that it was easier to manage their own applications and resources within the different environments for that. And it became easier also to upgrade and roll back a specific application that they had in mind, the web service application that they were running in containers. Another graduated project, in this case about networking, is Envoy. Envoy basically is used in most of the service mesh tools, open source or not available right now. I think it's the first choice worldwide. It's a proxy level 4 or level 7 open source tool, but it doesn't work only as a proxy, but also as they have functions for load balancing, traffic managing, API gateway, and so on. They have extra feature for service discovery, retries, and of course it's used in Kubernetes, but it works in microservices in general, but in any cloud native application. The example that I'm showing comes from Reddit, and in that case, this happened when Reddit started to grow, and they had to move to a microservice or a service-oriented infrastructure. And at that point, they had to improve their backends, and they needed something to better manage the communication between all these services. So in this case, they used Envoy, and again, they wrote articles about that. They're pretty interesting. They showed all the challenges that they had to face and how they fixed them. For example, they had to be very careful to integrate Envoy with what they already had in place, because they couldn't stop the infrastructure, but they had to integrate Envoy in what they had already, and write some custom integrations to support what they needed from an open source tool. So what I've showed so far are different use cases in which, on one side, maybe it's easier for you to just get an open source tool that brings you extra functionalities or advantages without any problem, let's say, to address. In some cases, you will need to address or adapt your open source tool to your environment. And the last example that I'm bringing today is Vitis or Vitis, I don't know how to pronounce it, to be honest, which works on the opposite way. So Vitis is a database clustering system that is for MySQL. The idea is to help you with add capacity to your databases without losing performance or reliability. But in this case, the process was the reversed one. So instead of having a need and looking for an open source tool, the company was YouTube or Google at the beginning in 2010, when they started thinking about this open source tool. And then at that time, they had a big problem, which was cats, because too many people were looking for cat videos on YouTube. So they were picking too much, and they needed something to fix what was their problem with the database side. And then And then that's why they came with the idea of writing their own tool, which is Vitus. And then once they realized that it was a very useful tool, not only for themselves, but that could be useful for other companies, they just donated to the open source community. So there are different approaches leading to the same result. Other graduated projects that I'm not going to talk about today, but they might be very interesting, related to policy engine, storage, orchestration, software update. Some of them are topics that we discussed already this morning, for example. So I'm really recommend, if you don't know these tools, to have a look at them because they might be useful for your use cases. But in general, the key points are that there are a lot of open source technologies. They can be used in the cloud environment, but they might be even too many, meaning that it's sometimes overwhelming for someone who doesn't know that much the cloud native ecosystem, how to approach it. And since we're spanning through a lot of different domains, which might go from container orchestration to service mesh, continuous delivery, storaging, and so on, it's also complicated to see where this relationship between open source tools starts and ends. Also because since it's an environment in which there's a constant update and changes over time, it's easy to lose track of them. Plus, new projects can be added or updated in a way that they might completely change the way they work. So the idea is that a project like OpenCloudification can also help you in that. And this is my last slide. So if there are questions or comments.
I think it makes sense, Luca, if we maybe try in the next couple of weeks to list out a number of the technologies like the ones you selected, and see if you can propose them to the user group and to the participants, whether they have some preferences in one versus the other that we would start looking into.
Of course, we started with the graduated one because it makes more sense. They're more advanced, let's say, or they have more functionalities, or they're considered as ready for the production environment, or mature, yeah. But there are also a lot of interesting incubating or sandbox tools that worth it to follow, because in the next year they're gonna be probably they're gonna graduate, as they call it.
Yeah. And part of the discussion that we had already this morning with the user group, you can take along as well and maybe select some of the technologies that you discover and say, okay, maybe for one of the companies here, this specific technology might be useful for this or that. That's maybe something that we can look into as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you don't have to follow everything, but
no, of course. I mean, this is to give a general idea on all the possibilities that are there, but there's no need to know all of them. As I said, I mean, the landscape is quite big. So I think no one knows all the open source tools that are available right now.
I'm going to say anything.
Yeah, that's only the, yeah, indeed.
Okay,